This panel is going to examine the role of biodefense and resiliency in dissuading and deterring biological weapons development and use. This is not a new concept. This is a long-standing strategy in the history of conflict and terrorism in the world. Terrorism by dissuasion, many people would define that as convincing adversaries that it's futile to mount an attack against us, the futility of competition in a particular arena. It's also kind of elides into the concept of deterrence by denial, which is sometimes defined as convincing adversaries that they will not succeed in their goals, or at least introducing sufficient doubt about success. We heard John Vitko speak about this quite articulately. In general, it builds around developing a sense of relative invulnerability, becoming a harder target, becoming a more resilient entity or country. Examples, obvious examples from history, anybody can pick them out, but an army that becomes so mighty that adversaries no longer consider confronting it, a technological edge that's developed that convinces adversaries that there's futility in trying to compete, an embassy that becomes so strong that a terrorist decides, or a group that decides that it's no longer a target or a viable target, which we know has happened. We have clear evidence and we have historical records on all of these things. So to talk about how this might relate to bio, and I think it surely does, but to get other views on this, we have three very distinguished panelists. Now, in reverse order, starting at the end, we have Dan Hamilton, who is the director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, who has spoken and written and worked on international issues related to deterrence for quite some time. Then we have Bob Kadlec, well known to most of you or all of you, the former Senior Director for Biodefense Policy on the Homeland Security Council and Special Assistant to the President, who actually was in charge of setting policy on many of these matters in the last administration. And we have the only second round panelist of the day, Randy Larsen, the Executive Director of the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism. So we're going to start by asking Randy to give us the views of the chair and the co-chair of the WMD Commission on this issue, and then his own views on these issues. We'll then ask Bob to speak about his judgments about resilience and biodefense, both as a means of deterrence, but also what's in it. If we take this as a proposition, how do we become resilient? How do we build a biodefense that is resilient? And lastly, we'll have Dan offer his views on biodefense and resiliency as a means of prevention, particularly in the sense of collective defense between countries, and how it might help us build stronger international partnerships. So with that, I'll stop, and Randy.
Thank you. Okay, on behalf of the WMD Commission, Senator Graham and Senator Talent both believe that being well prepared would provide some deterrence. Okay, that's the WMD Commission's position. Now I'm going to talk as Randy Larsen. Now, Senator Graham recently asked the CIA to prepare a briefing for him about really, if we were well prepared for a bio attack, would that be a deterrent? And we spent an afternoon out there with 7 really intelligent people, and it was a very interesting intellectual process to kind of move through the whole thing and discuss all the issues. When I walked away from that, I hadn't changed my mind at all, however, from how I believed about this for a long time. Deterrence worked in the Cold War because Soviet missiles would have come with return addresses, and the massive retaliation, I believe we can argue somewhat that that worked. I think that deterrence against nation-state attacks with biological weapons, I think deterrence still somewhat works. It's not as clear. There's the attribution process, but it's a pretty big gamble for a North Korea or Iran to think that they could attack us and kill a lot of people. That's a pretty big gamble because our response would be massive. The concern we're dealing with is a terrorist organization who doesn't have a country that we can hold hostage. So Randy Larsen's opinion is, I'm not a big believer in deterrence for the first attack, but I believe there is credibility for deterring future attacks and some of the things that Richard was just talking about. Short example. In the 90s, I commanded 2 large military organizations. We were always prepared to go to war where there was going to be not large-scale chemical attacks, but smaller scale. So 5 terrorists show up with 2 mortar tubes and fire in some VX rounds to our remote airbase. You know, it's hard to motivate young troops to be out there practicing all this MOP 4 stuff. And if you haven't been in MOP 4 in 95 degrees, well, you don't know what fun is when it's about 150 degrees inside the suit. So you got to motivate the troops, and so you explain to them, look, if a guy, they lob in 10 mortar rounds with VX gas and it completely shuts down the U.S. Air Force, we can expect to see this again if they see it works. On the other hand, if we're well prepared and we know how to launch our airplanes and do that in the chemical environment, the limited chemical environment, and we continue on, being well prepared may deter the second or third attack because they go, okay, well, this one really doesn't work as well as we really thought it would. So when we're talking about trying to deter terrorist organizations, the next attack, whatever that may be, if the United States responds very effectively, if everything just doesn't fall apart, if it looks like we have some plans and we have some good response capabilities, the government looks like it's in control, people respond properly, that then, I would argue, may help deter follow-on attacks. If our initial response we're not prepared for and the attack is very successful, then I think in that case I'm very convinced that we will see more attacks. Now,
Before you finish, do you want to say something about the paper that is in the journal or in the binder here, a commentary on prevention?
Yes. Senator Graham and Talent wrote a piece that was in the Journal of Biosecurity and Biodefense redefining prevention. And their key there was that, yes, we need to do all the things, UN 1540 and the Biological Warfare Convention and lab security and all of those things, yes, first thing we got to do. If we do all that perfectly, that doesn't significantly reduce the chance that at some point we're going to have a biological attack. So their new definition by Senator Graham and Talent of prevention includes preventing a bioattack from becoming a bio-Katrina because we're well prepared to respond. One of the things the Commission is focusing on right now, because we can't do everything, and I know that there are many things that are important. Cleanup is something that does not get never enough attention, that they recently addressed in an op-ed in the Washington Times recently about cleaning up after an anthrax attack. But one of the things we're trying to focus on right now is just one simple sentence. America needs the capability to produce vaccines and therapeutics rapidly and inexpensively. We think that capability is not just about public health, it's about national security. And we think that could change the world, and that's where we need to be focusing our efforts. Yes, there's many other things. That's the top priority for the Commission right now.
Okay. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Randy. And for my part, I think if anything, I'm going to ask a question. I think Richard's point is in some ways we haven't asked enough questions around these set of issues. So the question I'm going to ask you is a little bit odd in the sense of deterrence, but I guess it gets to the issue in the end, which I think is the one that we'd like to address as a panel, and that is resilience and maybe its contribution to deterrence. Question is, can we deter pandemic influenza? Absolutely. All right, well, that's good. Well, the thing is that I think it's worthwhile to maybe kind of pause and posit that question for a moment, primarily because we always think in deterrence strategy, and I'll leave it to Dan here to expound on this. I am not a serious student of deterrence strategy, but I am what I would say more than a casual observer. Because quite frankly, I don't think we know what deterrence means for biological events. Quite frankly, we have not had the benefit of multiple decades and esteemed scholars to evaluate what deterrence means for biological events, which on one hand can be natural, like a pandemic influenza event, or on the other hand could be deliberate and catastrophic, like a large-scale bioterrorism event. So in some ways, I think there's fertile ground for a rich discussion in this area of what that means. So in the case of, if you had to believe that in some ways you could deter pandemic influenza, one of the things you would say is we would deny the effect of a pandemic, period. Somehow we would be able to rapidly produce the kinds of vaccines that have the great specificity and have efficacy and safety, and rapidly distribute them and administer them to the American population and to other populations, quite frankly. This is not just an American problem. and be able to do that in a way that would basically effectively take pandemic off the table. Now, there is some evidence of thinking of this in the U.S. government, incomplete, and I'll pause it on that moment, on that idea there, that in some ways, the notion that we've accumulated 300 million doses of smallpox vaccine basically takes the smallpox problem off the table. Yes, you could get a couple million of us, but you're not going to get us all. And so in some ways, we've made some preliminary overtures in this area, but quite frankly, we have not really pulled through it. Now, to kind of go a little bit further on the deterrence theory of it is that pandemic influenza is not a thinking enemy. And in reality, deterrence is a mind game that we're playing with an adversary that suggests to them, as our defense policy or defense theory begins in Joint Pub 3-11. I know you'll run out of here right now and get your own copy of it. But the use of chemical, biological, radionuclear weapons should provide no advantages to adversaries, only harsh additional adverse consequences. So in some ways, there's this two-part equation, at least in the DoD mindset, of what constitutes deterrence against these kinds of activities. One is denial of effect, and the other one is a guarantee of adverse consequences. We're at a very interesting point, and not to move away from our beloved area of biological weapons, to at least note that there's another debate going on outside of this room, but in this town, on the subject of nuclear deterrence. I don't know what the nature of that conversation is in the Nuclear Posture Review or what's happening in the National Security Council, but I think it's interesting to note that recently in the Council of Foreign Relations Nuclear Posture Review that was headed by Brent Scowcroft and Bill Perry, obviously some heavyweights in this area, in the national security thing, they basically highlight the fact that somehow in the past we have built deterrence to extend to chemical and biological weapons by basically raising the ambiguity, the calculated ambiguity of the risk associated with the use of weapons. Meaning is you could use it against us, the effects may not be clear because we're going to do our best to defend, and we may be very, very angry and wipe you off the face of the earth. However, in their study, they basically posit this point, which is somehow we need to decrease the reliance on nuclear weapons for this purpose. So in some ways, we have a very interesting conversation that's going on in the related area on the issue of deterrence in a time when we really need to grapple what that means. I would suggest to you that, quite frankly, Randy was, very clear in what Senator Graham's and Talon have laid out, and that is in your handout today, subject to their article about prevention and what the theory of prevention is. But I think that is an area that I think highlights what maybe the direction, the trajectory we need to go as a nation and certainly as a community in this area. And that the idea is that somehow we have to not only prevent the risk, but also prevent the effect. And I think that's a very formidable kind of combination that we have. And it gets to this idea of resilience, because in the end, we may take the first hit. Some of you have seen, I have a slide that I often use that basically shows what a modest anthrax, large-scale anthrax event would happen in a major metropolitan area. Significant loss of life. 380,000 Americans potentially lose their life if we couldn't rapidly detect, decide, distribute, and administer countermeasures that we have in our stockpile today. Catastrophic failure if we couldn't do that. I would suggest to you that a critical element of that ability, and getting back to Richard's point, is that not only we have to do better in terms of our ability to respond and mitigate those events, but also prevent the next event, which Randy has pointed out as well, that somehow that has to be demonstrated. To highlight that idea that somehow the detection, decision, rapid distribution, and administration is critical. I mean, that was the whole point of the two pieces, again, long way to go in this area, but two pieces of the critical, what I would say, BioWatch Postal Service connection here. But there's more to this than just simply that, and that is the idea that somehow we have to bring the kind of speed, agility, and mass that, quite frankly, we do not have yet in our ability to mount an effective response from not only the idea of countermeasures that we may already have, but those we may need if we're to encounter something that is engineered to be resistant to countermeasures that we have or somehow represents a synthetic biology risk. So we have a long way to go. I will posit, though, 4 principles which I think get to the nub of what I think resilience is and what, in the case of what the opportunity is, to have that further the conversation around deterrence. One is we need to prevent bioterror attacks through a variety of mechanisms that you heard today. The good news is, as you heard from Laura Holgate, that there is a prevention strategy in the offing that in some ways this administration is putting their head around what are the kinds of things we can do domestically and internationally that can lower the risk, not eliminate it, but lower it. Then you have the idea that somehow we need to build capacity to mitigate the consequences of bioterror attacks and accelerate the development of new medicines and vaccines and production capabilities. And so that's the whole idea of resilience, that somehow you can deflect the blow once it's delivered, as well as prevent the blow before it's given. And then the last thing is to realize that we live in a world today that it's not good enough if the United States can protect itself. Because by the very evidence of what the impact of these events would have, whether they happen in India, the United Kingdom, or in Mexico, the fact that they could cross our borders, I mean, someone said it's a plane flight away, that's correct. But I think it's the whole idea of our collective security has to be somehow maximized by basically promoting really the effort to diminish the impact of major epidemics, particularly of infectious disease in the world. So I would suggest to you that resilience has a clear path forward. Those are not my principles, by the way. Those are the administration of Barack Obama's. So I think in some ways the issue of resilience is on the table. What has not been clarified is in the balance of things that we have to manage today, and there is no silver bullet. It'd be nice to make, from bug to drug in 7 hours or 7 days or whatever it is, 7 weeks. That's not going to solve the problem. But it's going to be a multi-layered, nuanced approach that we have yet to describe, collectively agree to, or build necessarily the cohesive, comprehensive policy around to basically give us the confidence that we can not only deter, but survive these events should they happen.
Thanks, Bob. Dan?
Well, I agree with a lot of that, and I should say I'm not a bio expert, but I've learned a lot from Tom and Randy and others over the years. We've been working together on some things. But I was asked, I think, put the bio issue in a broader context of the need for resilient strategies across the board in ways that also connect what we do right here at home with what we have to do abroad. And so I would approach this sort of, basic point that I think often the health communities and the national security communities, they talk past each other, different vocabularies, different ways of thinking, and thank God for that in many areas. And so much of this is not about trying to securitize health, but to talk about how we can enhance our health in ways that also enhance our national security and the resilience of our societies. I start with the point that was just made that we're not home alone. Even the term Homeland Security is a very inward-looking exercise. It's all about us, is the message we're conveying to everyone else. But the kinds of issues we're discussing here, and in many other areas, in fact, you're not home alone. Our resilience is going to depend on that of others. So one particular strategy and way of thinking is simply how we convey the message, is that we identify our resilience with that of others and publicly, and to back it up with concrete efforts that build on that sort of approach. I think in order to do that, one has to understand what it is we're actually defending. On the pure bio realm, we're talking obviously about human health. But if you think about how the health issue figures into broader context today, I think you start to provide this in a broader framework. And it goes back to sort of, the old notions of deterrence and national security and so on. It used to be about securing territory or force protection, that type of thing. But, what do Al-Qaeda, energy cartels, influenza, if you will, cyber terrorists, and breakdowns have in common. They're all networks. They are network-based challenges or threats to the networks that uphold free societies and are tremendously interconnected networks that maintain the societies that we work on. When the 9/11 happened, The Economist, said it was not only an attack on freedom, it was an attack through freedom. It was using the very instruments of a free society to identify its vulnerabilities and try to disrupt it. And I think this highlights that across the board, not just in this area, but in many other areas, what we are essentially trying to defend today is our connectedness, the connectedness and the critical functions of society. And this, I think, by relating the health challenge to other types of challenges about critical functions of society, starts to open up different ways you can build coalitions to understand how this issue itself can also be advanced. And that means that critical functions of society are dynamic. They're not static. The notion of critical infrastructure often is discussed in a very static way. These are things that we have to protect. But not in a network society. These are flows. How do you protect flows? And how do you prevent cascading effects on the kinds of flows that we would have if one of them would be disrupted? And how do you build redundancies into the system so that those could be mitigated or prevented? Also, if you think about it in this way, the U.S. domestic system vulnerabilities might be based abroad, not here. Richard's question was, he said the first thing a policymaker want to know is, where did this attack happen? Well, in this area, I would suggest it could have happened somewhere outside of the United States and yet been brought into the United States because, as I understand some of these issues, you won't even know the person's been sick until sometime later. They could have brought it in. So how do you do that? So local technologies aren't going to help that. You have to know what the system is with your partners in other countries to identify an attribute. When we were doing Atlantic Storm, at least at that time, and my colleagues can update me, the U.S. smallpox vaccine supply, the entire supply, had been produced by a small factory outside of Vienna, Austria, the entire supply, because we had no national capability to do this. Well, I think that's critical infrastructure. It's not based here. We didn't have the capacity domestically to even do it, and yet we're dependent on that in a neutral country, protected probably by a private security force, and not even thinking about it in the sense of what it means for our own either health or national security. So identifying and protecting those nodes in these networks, I think, and trying to mitigate these connectiveness vulnerabilities is a way to maybe think about that. Related is to take some of these old notions again and see what extent are they relevant to today's kinds of challenges. We still have a dominant national security mode of forward defense. That's still how we think, I think pretty much. We protect America somewhere else. That's the best way to do that. Well, in many ways, in a traditional sense, that's probably still a good strategy. You don't want things coming here. But if you think about resilience, shouldn't there be an equivalent notion of forward resilience? And that is that we project resilience, we help other societies or identify resilience with theirs, which means we want them to be very resilient in all the ways I've been mentioning, in the health area but elsewhere as well. And that starts to, if you start to assume that that's your self-interest, you start to build the procedures and habits and collaboration and kinds of mechanisms that would start to work on it. Standard operating procedures, STANOPs, even to use the type of military technology that one would do. If you can't project that type of resilience, you're not going to be able to protect yourself at home or those of your partners. And we are committed through various alliance obligations to defend, in fact, other partners as well. I think resilience also means being able to receive assistance, not just give it out. We've had two major incidents, Katrina and 9/11, in which other countries tried to help us, and yet we were incapable and unprepared to actually receive assistance. I would argue, I don't think those are probably going to be isolated, unfortunately, and that why we should, as a society, be able to be working on how to receive the types of assistance we might need and not just think it's always about us helping others. In terms of deterrence, I agree with what Randy said about the basic approach, but I think there are different understandings of deterrence, especially if you put the bio issue in this broader setting. There is not the traditional set, but you can't say, you know, the debate right now is about you can't deter a suicide bomber. But the suicide bomber is usually part of a network that's much broader. It has lots of enablers in it, people who help contribute. Many of them illicit or criminal organizations, other kinds of groupings that work. Deterrence does work against criminals. It has been shown to work. In fact, there's a whole international effort, deterrence in the law enforcement sense. And you can pick off in the network that ends up with that final result, enablers and accomplices and others, and try to go after those and pick apart those networks in that way. So it's a different sense of that. The other way, especially in the bio, I think, is to encourage self-deterrence. Instead of talking only about the highly dramatic consequences such an attack would have on the United States, it's probably useful to explain how a bio incident would sicken so many people, and to dishonor basically the whole notion that this could be something that would be useful to anyone, to dishonor and to turn back upon a potential attacker the notion of what the effect would be. It would repulse the type of public that would this type of attacker is trying to gain, the trying of public attention. In terms of dissuasion, I think dissuasion in the sort of the sort of parlance here is a little different than deterrence. You just want to convince the other side that it's just not worth the effort, I think, as was said. And I think in this context, the ability to rapidly produce vaccines, this whole effort would be, as Randy had said, I would agree with that. The single most important thing one could probably do is to simply produce this capability, but it has to be done with others, which means why some of the international efforts, it seems to me, still aren't quite matching up with what the ideas that we have to do. We have a treaty regime, biological weapons, all this type of stuff, very important to set a normative bar and to assign some hurdles. But it's very hard to verify all the issues that are, troubles that are associated with that regime. And from the foreign policy world, the world of diplomats, that's really where most of that ends in terms of what we try to do. And yet it seems to be almost grafting, as others have written, trying to take the nuclear world, what we know about that and non-proliferation, grafting it onto the bio world, despite all the very, very different attributes and characteristics of bio issues. And so applying the nuclear Cold War mindset of the treaties and arms control and all of this into this other world just has many, many problems, even though elements of it probably are useful. If you think about health and resilience in the broader multi-sectoral sense of all these networks, then you want to have a multi-sectoral strategy, not a primarily national security type of strategy. It means law enforcement, health, all sorts of other things, societal issues that you could put together. It means early warning and detection. It means sharing cultures. I understand, again, you correct me, but I understand even with our closest allies today, we do not share in our labs some of the cultures that we would need for rapid identification across borders. And simple techniques like that would seem to me to be moving things forward, aligning standards on what we mean on these types of issues. So, in the international sphere, simply a somewhat different mindset that doesn't try to take the nuclear approach into the bio world, but tries to understand the bio characteristics on their own with this sort of network-based resilience approach that includes some elements of deterrence and dissuasion, but has a very different quality to it. I think if you start on that, again, these are all minimizing the risks. They aren't the direct deterrents, but they start to maybe a broader-based strategy that minimize the possibilities that we would face this type of situation.
Thanks, Dan. Maybe it's worth asking a couple of the questions that Richard asked us to ask ourselves along the lines of what would we say to policymakers or the president who is considering how to prepare the country for this, for these kinds of events? And I'll couple of questions in a row, and then maybe answer the third one. So for the first question, what is it that we should do to try and prevent these things from happening? I think we have a lot of things to think about from today and elsewhere, our work, about what's on that list. And there could be some debate about what that approach would be. The President takes the answer. Second question, can you assure me that what you are telling me to do in the realm of prevention will prevent a biological attack in the country? And I think most of us would have to honestly answer that question as no. So the next question would be, what is it that we can do if there is an attack that would minimize its impact? And I think that has international ramifications as well. What is it that we can do if our close allies were attacked in a similar way? I think Richard's point about how we would be grossly irresponsible if we hadn't fully considered the question of who did this to us, I think could be posed in a very similar way when we got asked, what is it that we've been doing for the last decade to prepare ourselves for such a thing, and would we be able to respond to attack and minimize consequences? So I think they're the lines between these questions are inextricably linked and are quite tight. I'd like to ask the group to say a little more about what they think. Dan ended with it, the idea of an international, it's not just vaccine for us alone that we should worry about, but it's international collaborations towards those ends. What is on the list of preparing our country or other countries concretely for these kinds of events that both would help us respond and, if you take the proposition, would help us deter attackers from believing they could substantially hurt us? I have my list. What's on your list?
I think the last little paragraph in Senator Graham and Talent's article that's in the handout, if you haven't read it, you should. It's very short, just 2 pages. That long-term strategy that we should convince the President that needs to be is taking biological weapons off the table as a WMD. We can never do that with nuclear weapons. We can't harden cities, and we can never have a good response that's going to work after a nuke. But the nation and perhaps the international community should be, it's not going to happen next year, it's probably not going to happen the next decade, but to have that long-term goal so we know where we're headed, as Richard was talking about, is to take biological weapons off the table as a WMD. I think that is capable, and it should be the nation's goal. And perhaps the international issue, which we discovered working with Dan Atlantic Storm, is there's no organizations to work through this issue right now. But that's my number one.
I would suggest to you that, and this is kind of a little out of left field, but somehow we have to change the view in the policymaker's mind that somehow we can predict these events. I think there's some sense in the intel conversation, you heard a little of that, where, we have strategic warning, and that's as good as it gets. I reflect back on the work that was done on pandemic influenza, not that that has to do with this, other than to say it highlights what I think is maybe the reality. And there's buried in the paragraph in the executive summary of the pandemic influenza strategy is a line that goes something like this. We can't guarantee that H5N1 will be the next pandemic. In fact, it may be some other virus, but we can guarantee that there will be a next pandemic. And the notion that, and again, that's one of the few correct things I've ever read in a federal document, I believe. But it gets to something.
Did you write
that I think it's no, I didn't actually. Hats off to whoever did. I think it was Rajiv. But the point is that it's kind of like, and here I'm going to go to topical now books, the black swan, something that is unpredictable, that could have catastrophic events, and when we look back on it, we said, shoot, we should have been thinking of this. The same point that Richard made earlier, that somehow we need to do it. So somehow we have to suggest to ourselves that, and it gets back to this idea of resiliency in the book Black Swan, they talk about preparedness. that you should forget about predicting things and you just prepare for a number of eventualities, and realizing you can't choose one, scenario-based is not the best way to go, but you need to find in a broad range of possibilities that you have to prepare yourself for. And I think that's the first step, is to think about the problem correctly, because we're not going to predict when it's going to happen. We're not going to predict if it's Al-Qaeda or another deranged scientist, domestic or international. We're not going to predict if it's, H5N1 or H9N1. We're just bad at it. And we have a track record of being bad at it. Overwhelming bad track record at it. So the question is we should just kind of convince ourselves that there's no leap of faith here, other than the fact that we have to commit to, I think, a commitment over the near and long term, because we never know when these things can happen, and build the kind of resilient systems that we have. I'll just highlight about internationalism. So, we've proposed it's been proposed to use the Postal Service as an idea to rapidly distribute the countermeasures. Not a bad idea, not the best idea, not the only idea. But the point is that that's been taken to NATO, for example. So in some ways, we've been moving that along through the usual drone of the bureaucratic process. But I think there are many things of that nature that we can expand. Manufacturing of countermeasures, critical one, I think. Okay, we, the United States, in our largesse, gave 10 million doses, 20 million doses maybe, of pandemic influenza vaccine that is part of a 100 million dose supply for WHO to administer. There's 6 billion or more people out there that need the vaccine. I think we can do better on that one, huh? So the thing is that there's a lot of room for improvement, so to speak, and I think we do need to take a little bit more of an international view on this, from the standpoint is that, and it is in a little bit of self-interest, that these things can happen overseas, as Dan said. These, we planned, or we predicted that the pandemic would happen in Southeast Asia. Oops, Southwest United States. So I think there's much more we can do in that area.
Well, I agree with that. I think understanding the nature of the unique characteristics is important, especially at the policy level. I was also in the State Department, and I think what's come out of Atlantic Storm in my own experience is that people often at that level think somehow the scientists have the answer on these issues, or it's a very technical field, and that technical office, if you'd ever need it, would come and just tell you what the answer is, and they've been working on it a long time. And what you see in the kind of simulations we've done is that science does not give you the answer if you're the policymaker. I think Richard said it. He'll want to know these questions. Was that what they were working on? Do they agree? And the Atlantic Storm, when it came to sharing vaccine and diluting it, the procedure in the United States and scientific consensus on that, we found, was different than in Europe. The conclusion here was, yes, you could probably dilute a little bit. In Europe, they came a completely different conclusion, said you can't do it. So when it came down to the real-life crisis of the people in the room making a decision, they got different answers. They had to decide on their own, regardless of what the scientists said. So some understanding of this and realizing the limits and natures of science when it comes to the policy in a crisis is important. I think the other, I'd just say it again, societal resilience, the broader-based notion of resilience in all its different arteries and networks also enhances this issue, because it's then seen as part of a broad-based societal effort, and that you can't have a resilient society here unless you're connected and do it with others. And that the institutional frameworks we have created in the security realm don't do this. It's nice to take it to NATO. NATO doesn't know how to do this. It's not equipped to do this whatsoever. And there's, in fact, within the NATO structure, a lot of allies would resist thinking of NATO as the right mechanism for doing this. So you've got a political problem to even try it that way. The WHO would seem to be one option, but that's dependent on nations. It's not a self-standing, independent thing. It depends on the political will of the nations providing it. But if you take the NATO sort of image, what did NATO do when we did think we had an existential threat? We had systems in place doing very granular type of planning for a wide spectrum of contingencies. They're supposed to still be doing it today. And yet, why not have that same type of collaborative international effort for these kinds of contingencies in a very different type of network then? It's not going to be probably NATO doing that or the military in that sense. It's going to be a very different type of team. But the same degree of recognition, you have to get to this level of planning, these kinds of scenarios, and how we would work together. To take one last term from the Cold War and so on, in the nuclear world, we had something called flexible response. It was, we had moved back from massive retaliation to say, well, maybe we have to tailor our response to a Soviet attack, and it was, it was a whole strategy. Well, if you try to transpose that notion of being flexible in a response, it comes back to what Randy was saying about the ability to generate on short notice the type of vaccine capabilities that would respond and be flexible to the particular challenge at hand. And why not do that with your closest allies at least? Some sort of, I think other colleagues at UPMC would talk about a warm base. You have an alliance base, a warm base that can produce this type of thing. Maybe you don't call it the alliance because, again, the military, it's a health, collaborative, international health collaborative that works on this type of thing, in which you're sharing some of these procedures. Also sharing investigative capabilities, certain standards that would be aligned, the kinds of things we did in other areas that are just habits of collaboration. You start to build habits of collaboration in this area, you start to, you can't predict the exact thing that'll happen, but you at least have some way to be prepared to react if it does.
So I want to give anyone who has a burning desire to ask a question a chance. We're getting close to 5 o'clock, but certainly there's time for a question or two. Okay, excellent. Burning question.
Well, actually, it's not really a question, but I have a burning comment. So in terms of a resilient nation, one could argue that nations that offer universal health insurance to their population would be inherently more resilient at responding to a crisis than a bioterrorist attack or epidemic than others. When you recall that during the anthrax attacks, the people who were infected were postal workers, and they had insurance. And the people who died, well, it wasn't because they didn't have insurance, it was because they delayed seeking care. But everybody had insurance. Now, just imagine if people, we have 45 million people approximately without health insurance, and let's say a fraction of them come down with a deadly communicable disease, and it's been shown that people without health insurance delay seeking care. So if you have a large fraction of the population delaying seeking care because they don't have insurance and they don't want to risk bankruptcy, you're inherently less resilient at responding. So I think that our current mess of a healthcare system is a national security issue that should be addressed. And I think as Congress is deliberating on healthcare, I think it behooves us to inform them that this is a national security issue. It's not just a health issue or a moral issue, but it would make us more resilient to respond to crises. Thanks.
Thanks for the point. Another comment?
Yes, thank you. I enjoyed the discussion very much this afternoon. But in thinking about it, and thinking about who our enemies are and what they're trying to do now, attacking us on the cyber front, looking for ways to compromise our industries, our economy, biological attacks. Is anyone looking at it, not approaching this in a unity approach, looking at, here we are, we have biological weapons, and we've spent all day talking about how we defend against it, but that perfect storm where someone compromises the electrical grid and then launches a biological attack, do we have people looking at those kinds of complex scenarios?
Yes.
I think that's one of the issues about the thinking enemy. I've been sometimes known to say that the worst terrorist is Mother Nature, or first bioterrorist is Mother Nature, but then Tom always reminds me that Mother Nature is not a thinking enemy, and a thinking enemy would do something like that, that if You know, just how would you do it if you were designing a bioattack? First thing you do is take down 911, then you'd take down, slow down the internet as much as you could, which does so much of our stuff. So yeah, I think that's a very serious thing. I see a lot of exercises at the federal government, though. They just say, okay, we're just going to do this. Or we say, ooh, there's going to be an anthrax attack on Pittsburgh. When people figure out how to do this to make a significant quantity, 1 or 2 pounds of dry powdered anthrax, it's probably going to be 10 cities. So we tend not to do that, which I think is a mistake in our exercises and perhaps in our thinking, because I think it will be a complex attack.
Can I, at the risk of putting in a plug here, we are one of these National Centers of Excellence on Homeland Security at Johns Hopkins, and our center does the international piece. We have a series of books, actually, we could provide to you, or you can get them on online, on unconventional crises. And one, in fact, we're releasing a new one on October 30th called Leadership in Unconventional Crises. And it's exactly the point you just made. What happens if it all kind of goes bad all at once? How do you even start to make sense of that? Complexity. There's another book we have called Hypercomplexity. It's really simply, you know, it all hits at the same time, and how can you think about it? So a couple of those articles, I think, are become standard material in some of the DHS training courses and some of the other executive branch courses for officers and others. So there is a series there. We did one on 5Ds, on I can't remember all, deterrence, dissuasion, all of that, denial, and how it applies to Homeland Security, which gets into this. So you know, there are some references out there.
Okay. Let me see if I can just make a few, give you a few of the things that I'll take away from the discussion today. I'm persuaded that we have a serious lab security and oversight system in place for U.S. life sciences, and that we should consider changes to it very, very carefully, given the possible adverse consequence of that. And there's a lot going on in this space, and we all need to examine it pretty carefully. I think that was very clearly articulated early in the day. National programs around biodefense, both U.S. and other programs, should be as transparent as they possibly can be. And while we didn't talk about it much, my sense is that the U.S. program is fairly transparent, though often criticized. I think other programs should actually aspire to be as transparent as the U.S. program largely is. Physical inspection and verification, we heard almost nothing about it today. And I think that's because the sense of the community is that verification of bioscience labs around the world is all but impossible. And calls for that, I think, are somewhat of a distraction from making real progress. Moral and behavioral norms against biological weapons, we talked about that. And I think there's undisputed great value to those norms, and they should be deepened and preserved to the extent that we can by various means. Certainly the BWC is a critical part of that. Intelligence is a key part of bioprevention strategy, but there are no guarantees. We shouldn't expect tactical warning, and we should build the capacity in the IC for more bio-intel expertise. International surveillance programs, we had a good discussion about that. Undisputed public health importance. Networks are important. There are various ways of going about this. And I think thinking through how we build out the next generation of CTR or whatever surveillance efforts we pursue and combining them with other efforts in the government is going to be very important and perhaps complicated, but key work. Microbial forensics is important, very important, and at a relatively young stage. It could help us with attribution. Yep. And then our last panel, and many, many good thoughts in a brief time. A good response to a first attack may deter a second attack. Resilience is part of a larger strategy. There are resilience conversations going on in Washington, and we should be part of those conversations and be aware of them. We're not home alone. There's an international community that's working on resilience as well, and we should not neglect that discussion. And biodefense and resilience are, at least for some, and I'm one of them, a persuasive part of a prevention strategy and should be discussed as such. And finally, I think we heard again and again that no matter how enlightened our prevention programs, we need to continue to be able to answer the President when he asks or she asks that we have done all that we can to build a robust and strong biodefense and resilient country on these matters. So there's a lot to consider. We asked more questions than we answered probably, but that was the point. And with that, let me thank the important people who put this day on. Let me thank the Sloan Foundation again and Paolo Olszewski for your support. The WMD Commission in its work. Many people are here from the Commission, and particularly Randy for his leadership of that as the Executive Director, and Senators Graham and Talent, who are not here with us today. Let me thank our speakers and panelists, who I think were superb. Let me just have a round of applause. And let me thank Gigi Quick-Rumval, Jen Nuzzo, Nidhi Bori, Joanna Engstrom, Mary Beth Hansen, Molly DeSopo, and I don't want to keep going, but the staff of the Center for Biosecurity has put in a lot of time and effort to try and make this a good event where you all could think and have full tummies and now go upstairs and have an enjoyable discussion afterwards. So let me thank all of you last for spending a day with us. This is an amazing amount of FTE time for all of us together to spend on this discussion, and I hope you all found it valuable. So please come upstairs and continue the conversation at the reception. There's a sign to get upstairs, and for those of you who can't stay, hopefully we'll see you soon. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you. This panel is going to examine the role of biodefense and resiliency in dissuading and deterring biological weapons development and use. This is not a new concept. This is a long-standing strategy in the history of conflict and terrorism in the world. Terrorism by dissuasion, many people would define that as convincing adversaries that it's futile to mount an attack against us. The futility of competition in a particular arena. It's also kind of elides into the concept of deterrence by denial, which is sometimes defined as convincing adversaries that they will not succeed in their goals, or at least introducing sufficient doubt about success. We heard John Vitko speak about this quite articulately. In general, it builds around developing a sense of relative invulnerability, becoming a harder target, becoming a more resilient entity or country. Examples, obvious examples from history, anybody can pick them out, but an army that becomes so mighty that adversaries no longer consider confronting it, a technological edge that's developed that convinces adversaries that there's futility.
Responds very effectively if everything just doesn't fall apart. If it looks like we have some plans and we have some good response capabilities, the government looks like it's in control, people respond properly, that then, I would argue, may help deter follow-on attacks. If our initial response we're not prepared for and the attack is very successful, then I think in that case I'm very convinced that we will see more attacks. Now,
before you finish, do you want to say something about the paper that is in the journal or in the binder here, a commentary on prevention?
Yes. Senator Graham and Talent wrote a piece that was in the Journal of Biosecurity and Biodefense, redefining prevention. And their key there was that, yes, we need to do all the things, UN 1540 and the Biological Warfare Convention and lab security and all of those things, yes, first thing we got to do. If we do all that perfectly, that doesn't significantly reduce the chance that at some point we're going to have a biological attack. So their new definition by Senator Graham and Talent of prevention includes preventing a bioattack from becoming a bio-Katrina, because we're well prepared to respond. One of the things the Commission is focusing on right now, because we can't do everything, and I know that there are many things that are important. Cleanup is something that does not get never enough attention, that they recently addressed in a...
Judgments about resilience and biodefense both as a means of deterrence, but also what's in it. If we take this as a proposition, how do we become resilient? How do we build a biodefense that is resilient? And lastly, we'll have Dan offer his views on biodefense and resiliency as a means of prevention, particularly in the sense of collective defense between countries, and how it might help us build stronger international partnerships. So with that, I'll stop, and Randy.
Thank you. Okay, on behalf of the WMD Commission, Senator Graham and Senator Talent both believe that being well prepared would provide some deterrence. Okay, that's the WMD Commission's position. Now I'm going to talk as Randy Larsen. Now, Senator Graham recently asked the CIA to prepare a briefing for him about really, if we were well prepared for a bioattack, would that be a deterrent? And we spent an afternoon out there with 7 really intelligent people, and it was a very interesting intellectual process to kind of move through the whole thing and discuss all the issues. When I walked away from that, I hadn't changed my mind at all, however, from how I believed about this for a long time. Deterrence worked in the Cold War because Soviet missiles would have come with return addresses and the massive retaliation. I believe we can argue somewhat that that worked. I think that deterrence against nation-state attacks with biological weapons, I think deterrence still somewhat works. It's not as clear. There's the attribution process.
In trying to compete, an embassy that becomes so strong that a terrorist decides, or a group that decides that it's no longer a target or a viable target, which we know has happened. We have clear evidence, and we have historical records on all of these things. So to talk about how this might relate to bio, and I think it surely does, but to get other views on this, we have 3 very distinguished panelists. Now, in reverse order, starting at the end, we have Dan Hamilton, who is the director of the Center for Transatlantic Relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS, who has spoken and written and worked on international issues related to deterrence for quite some time. Then we have Bob Kadlik, well known to most of you or all of you, the former Senior Director for Biodefense Policy on the Homeland Security Council and Special Assistant to the President, who actually was in charge of setting policy on many of these matters in the last administration. And we have the only second round panelist of the day, Randy Larsen, the Executive Director of the Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation, and Terrorism. So we're going to start by asking Randy to give us the views of the chair and the co-chair of the WMD Commission on this issue, and then his own views on these issues. We'll then ask Bob to speak about his...
But it's a pretty big gamble for a North Korea or Iran to think that they could attack us and kill a lot of people. That's a pretty big gamble because our response would be massive. The concern we're dealing with is a terrorist organization who doesn't have a country that we can hold hostage. So Randy Larsen's opinion is, I'm not a big believer in deterrence for the first attack, but I believe there is credibility for deterring future attacks and some of the things that Richard was just talking about. Short example. In the 90s, I commanded 2 large military organizations. We were always prepared to go to war where there was going to be not large-scale chemical attacks, but smaller scale. So 5 terrorists show up with 2 mortar tubes and fire in some VX rounds to our remote air base. You know, it's hard to motivate young troops to be out there practicing all this MOP 4 stuff. If you haven't been in MOP 4 in 95 degrees, well, you don't know what fun is when it's about 150 degrees inside the suit. So you got to motivate the troops, and so you explain to them, look, if a guy, they lob in 10 mortar rounds with VX gas and it completely shuts down the U.S. Air Force, we can expect to see this again if they see it works. On the other hand, if we're well prepared and we know how to launch our airplanes and do that in the chemical environment, the limited chemical environment, and we continue on, being well prepared may deter the second or third attack because they go, okay, well, this one really doesn't work as well as we really thought it would. So when we're talking about trying to deter terrorist organizations, the next attack, whatever that may be, if the United States responds